Today, on the second part of our Flowery Edition video, we are talking about something interesting which might in the end not matter for 99% of you, but as we made this video, maybe you might be still interested in the content of this video, which is a nerf in Mythic Plus. Now, bear with me for a second. The nerf in question is a feature which went mostly unused for a while until players realized the power of this feature in the dungeon, which is the burning chains in Neltharus. TLDR, these are things you can click in Neltharus dungeon that give you a cooldown, so you can't use them all the time by yourself, but once you pick up these chains you can run further away from the chains to break them, and those will do a ton of damage to the NPCs, to the mobs in the key. This means you can essentially group up as big of a pool as you can next to a chain, pick up the chain. Multiple players can pick up the chains at the same time. Multiple sets of chains can be used, one after the other, to essentially just one-shot entire packs of mobs. This made, of course, progressing through Neltharus very fast, very easy, and also trivialized a big part of the dungeon. Now, this one having a 3-minute cooldown, essentially you could just group up all the mobs every 3 minutes, and then in between those pools you could make another big pool with all of your cooldowns, and then the next pool you could use the chain again, right, and repeat this way the entire dungeon. It was calculated, for example, that compared to other items, other interactable things in other dungeons in the past, like using cannons or zaps or Kyrian weapons in previous dungeons, like for example Tol Dagor, Siege of Boralus, the Junkyard, or Necrotic Wake, those dungeons sat around the 15 to 20% extra damage in a key from those items. The top up to now was Tol Dagor, upwards of 28%, but that was intended. You were supposed to have a whole set of the dungeon where you were using a cannon to do damage to mobs. Meanwhile, Neltharus sat above 40% of the damage done in a key by these chains, which of course becomes even more important during Fortified because of the power of the trash mobs. What's the change? What's the hot fix that Blizzard put up after they saw the degeneracy of this strategy? The change is that previously you had some types of mobs that can trigger and be hit by the chains, another type of mobs that cannot trigger the chain itself but can be hit by the following explosion, and then mobs that cannot be hit at all by the chains. They are basically immune, including the stun of the chains. The change is that now roughly 60 or more % of the mobs that could previously be damaged by the chains, although they were immune to the initial stun, now can't actually be hit at all by the chains. We're talking about things like the Kalashi Spine Crusher, the Thaumaturge, the Iron Torch, the Bone Splitter, the Lava Bearer. All of these mobs now basically just ignore the chains altogether, both the damage and the stun. This is quite impactful because basically now every zone in the dungeon except the main one of Chargath, the boss, is basically not affected by the chains, which would significantly slow down now the progress of the key, on top of now having to change the route, because, for example, if you have maybe seen it yourself in Neltharus keys, one of the popular strategies now is to start the pool, and rather than, as it was popular previously, just going left and continue left immediately, many players now started grouping the first packs to the left with packs to the right all together next to the chains to break them up. For example, now if you do that after this hotfix, to the right those mobs would not be affected by the chains, for example. So this is a problem, not because of this change, not because of a fix that was needed, because it was trivializing basically half of the entire trash of the dungeon. Of course, it was a needed nerf. However, it becomes a problem when now this follows a series of other nerfs done to the so-called, by myself, Exodia comp, which has allowed many players to go up 3, 4, 5 even levels of keys in Mythic Plus in the first 2 weeks of the 10.1.5 patch. The first, I think it was Fortified week, followed by the second week, which was Tyrannical. So those first 2 resets were the unnerfed resets, where only a minor nerf to Fire Mage happened after that first week. So in those first 2 weeks, if you had the time and if you had the comp, the right specs, you could just dump a lot of time into those keys and get a massive advantage, because after those 2 weeks we have gotten the nerf to Guardian Druid, the nerf to Shadow Priest, the nerf to Fire Mage, the nerfs to Augmentation Evoker in Mythic Plus, as well as the nerfs to Holy Paladin. And now you also have a nerf to Neltharus, which is going to make it even harder. Everyone, for example, who managed to push a Neltharus plus 29 before, for example, on week 1 with no specs nerfed and no Neltharus nerfed, how are they going to push it now? What about all the other groups that were up to a plus 27 and plus 28, and now it was their time to try a plus 29, and all of the specs got nerfed, and now Neltharus has been made harder. Those specs, those players are now essentially stuck. They can very likely not progress anymore higher than what it was previously possible because of these nerfs. That's why I said it's likely not gonna matter for the majority of the player base, because you won't really be gated by continuing your progress in your Mythic Plus keys. If you were doing 17s or 20s or 22s, definitely it's still gonna be possible, but it is still going to create an issue where we pointed out as soon as we saw the power of this comp at the beginning of 10.1.5, this comp is too powerful. Now Blizzard has an issue. Either they let this comp completely untouched until the end of the season to allow everyone to have a chance at, trying this comp at the cost of making basically every other spec depressed, crying in a corner, or they start nerfing these specs to make them more in line with the rest. The problem is, the longer they wait, the more they wait with these nerfs, the more time you give to the early birds to get the worm. The more time you give them to push high keys now before the specs get nerfed. So once the nerfs actually come through, those players are just chilling because they already completed their plus 30, their plus 29, which is now going to be much, much harder with the specs being nerfed. And this Neltharus change, even though it's not a spec nerf, even though it doesn't punish the Exodia specs, it still goes to favor everyone who was pushing Neltharus in the first couple of weeks before this chains being nerfed, because now it's going to be much harder for groups to do the same thing those other comps did, because the chains are not going to work on 60% of the mobs. So it's now going to be made much harder to continue to climb, to continue to progress through this key. That is a problem that, it's going to start affecting some players that wanted to push. Maybe now you deplete a Neltharus key by 30 seconds to 1 minute. Now you will have in mind that if you only did that key 1 week ago, you could have timed the key before this nerf. And unfortunately you were 1 week late, so now you don't get to upgrade your key anymore. That's kind of the issue we are having right now with this extra nerf to Neltharus. It's not a problem with Neltharus itself, of course. It's not an issue that Neltharus was nerfed, because, as I said, these chains were getting out of control. Of course, the players, once they realized their power, they started to abuse the chains as expected, so Blizzard had to rein them in. The issue is likely the speed. Basically, Blizzard came out after the release of this patch. I'm not talking about 10.1.5, I'm talking about the season 2. They had a few balance tuning changes in the first 2 to 3 weeks. They had some spec changes, they had some dungeon nerfs over time, of course, because season 2 brought us new dungeons, so they had some continuous changes to the dungeons, but then they sort of went to sleep. They went to sleep for about a month and a half, letting the season go as natural as possible, until 10.1.5 hit. They created an abomination of a composition in Mythic Plus, and they let basically the composition be for a couple of weeks before giving out any nerfs, which has hurt the competitiveness of the season. Many players, you might have heard already, pointing out how the season is ruined. The season is now basically done. Now many players are basically losing incentives, losing any type of push, any type of willingness to continue to try hard in Mythic Plus, because they feel like if you missed out, if you skipped the first couple of weeks of the season, you are now too far behind. You're now just behind the curve of all of those super powerful unnerfed specs in unnerfed dungeons of the first couple of weeks. That is kind of a bit sad part of this patch. I guess that's how it will be remembered. The fact that we are getting a new spec out, plenty of new specs became more meta compared to what we have seen at the start of this expansion, like Fire Mage and Guardian Druid, even Holy Paladin not being particularly popular before this patch. However, the manner in which they became popular, the way in which they did so, and more importantly, the dominance, the power they currently have, is souring a little bit more this patch. We finish by saying that at the very least, one of the glass half full takes I was having before the release of this patch was, at the very least, this patch is coming out 2 months into the season. Just imagine if this was the release of the actual season, of the actual raid, and the release of the actual Mythic Plus, and the disaster that this meta could have caused. At least now it's coming in 2 months later. At least many players now maybe already are done with the season, are done with raiding or with doing Mythic Plus, so it's not gonna hurt as much. So hopefully, before we get to Season 3, where things will matter much more, things will get a little bit more balanced and a little bit more in line with the rest of the specs, for example, in terms of power. That's the hope for the beginning of Season 3. So that's what I had to talk about for today in my TED Talk about the sort of skewed season that was created by the power of these specs. And I will leave you with that as your food for thought. Of course, you're always welcome to let me guys know your thoughts in the comments as we leave each other for today. So thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which you can still give out for free. Of course, you can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, we can now leave each other. Thank you guys, of course, for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, finally, temperature went down by 6 to 7 degrees. It's now much more manageable. I am in a closed room filled with lights on my face, and I'm not even close to sweating. That's good.